So welcome, everybody. Welcome to your United in Strengths community, where we are here, myself, Ryan Niemiec, with Ruth Pierce and the VIA Institute. We're all here to try to do three things, at least: to remember that we have 24 character strengths to turn to, and that we can pause to breathe throughout our day, which can be invaluably helpful to just remember to do that. And that we can connect, so that we can connect here with one another. And that word connect can be a reminder to err on the side of connecting with people in our life, whether that's family or friends or a neighbor that might be in need, or work colleagues and so on. So remember, breathe, and connect in any order. So today's topic, as planned, is on loneliness. And we've dabbled with this topic in United in Strengths before, but never really looking at it in any kind of deep way. And it's a really important topic because there's many levels to it. There's many distinctions to make. There's some demystifying because the media actually does a poor job at actually discussing loneliness and the actual research on it. And as always, what we do in these United in Strengths sessions is we always want to make things practical. So we'll talk about practical strategies as well. So to start, a really interesting distinction to start with is that there is a big difference between loneliness and being alone. And so that's just a really important piece to start with, is that these are two completely different things. And if we look at those as two different things, aloneness and loneliness, aloneness literally meaning you're just not with people in that particular moment. And then loneliness being more of a emotional sadness, a mental feeling of being down and feeling kind of alone in this world in a sad way. So there's a big difference between those two things. We can actually then break it down into three different categories, at least. There's the person who's the first one is the person who is alone, but not lonely, right? We can be alone and not lonely. So I think of a neighbor of mine, we'll call her Donna, and she lives alone. She has lived alone in this neighborhood ever since she arrived. Has never had anybody live with her. She's probably 70 years old. And yet nobody would describe her as lonely, even though she's alone, is that she is always talking to people, neighbors and others. And, I'll go out into this bike trail that's about 10 minutes from my house, or actually 2 minutes from my house. And I'll see her there, wandering around talking to people like, oh yeah, I was just talking to these kids about something, or I was talking to this couple over here. And just always seems quite happy. Now, I've not specifically sat down and said, do you feel lonely most of the time in your life? So I technically don't know the answer to that question, but my guess is she'd be a good descriptor. She would be a good example of someone who's alone but not lonely. You might think about a monk who is spends so much time in solitude, but is doing that by choice. A monk or a nun in solitude, and studying and learning and being out in nature and alone so much of the time. And perhaps some might be lonely, but perhaps many are not. I think of myself when I go on mindfulness retreats, that I just set up mindfulness retreats for myself. Well, I'll go to a retreat center and I'm kind of leading myself on the retreat, so there isn't a retreat leader and there's no other retreat people participating with me. I'm just kind of doing my own journey as I go and walk a labyrinth, and then I go out for a walk in nature, and I do some reading, I do some journaling, I do some drawing, I have some food, and I do some meditation practice and some strength practice, and I kind of have this agenda, spontaneous or structured. And I'm very much alone for if that's a day or a week, but not really at all lonely. That would never really be something that I would use to describe the experience. So that's one category. Then another category is the obvious. What we think of with this stuff is somebody who's alone and lonely. So and that's where it's upsetting to the person. They are by themselves and they're upset about that. And they're upset that they're not around people. And over time, if someone is alone and lonely, then that's going to be more of a risk for that person for developing more serious problems, whether that's depression or anxiety or other kinds of issues. So for that, I think of Suzette, who recently lost her job about 4 months ago. And she happened to live alone. All of her social connecting was at work, and now she's not working and not Zooming with people. And she's someone that really didn't and doesn't have many friends, not many people to turn to. And to her disadvantage, she's not great at reaching out to people. Just not her. Some people are natural extroverts. They reach out to people all the time. They initiate. Suzette is not an initiator. And she doesn't initiate, and I would describe her, even though she's a great person, she's not particularly friendly in that sense. She's lower in social intelligence on the VIA survey, so that's one of her bottom 5 strengths. She also happens to be lower on a lot of the relationship-oriented strengths, those strengths that are just natural connecting strengths like kindness and love and forgiveness and fairness. She's higher in a lot more of the intellectual strengths like love of learning and curiosity and judgment, critical thinking. So she ends up kind of being alone in her head, if that makes sense, alone in her thoughts, not only alone in her thoughts, but then alone socially, especially now. And then that bothers her, and that makes her feel more sad. And those feelings of loneliness, just more, the word might be poignant, which is that word for like piercing. She can feel that strongly in her body. So that's a good example then of that category of alone and lonely. And then we can think of another category of lonely when you're with people, which sounds a little weird at first if you haven't thought of that before, but feeling alone and you're in a group, you're around people. So that's less obvious. And perhaps you relate to that when you've been around one group of people at work or at school or around certain acquaintances or people in your neighborhood, and you're maybe discussing things with people, but you don't feel like you're connecting with them, and you kind of feel like you're alone in the way that you think about things, and maybe you feel like you don't belong to that particular group. Belonging, by the way, is going to be a future topic here at United in Strengths. There's a lot to say about belonging. But you feel like you don't belong. You feel by yourself. I can think of many times for myself. I feel fairly predisposed for this category of feeling lonely, even when I'm with people. I think there's something about me where that happens a lot. And so I think most strongly was when I was an undergraduate student, university. And I was part of a group I was kind of part of this group that was a very cliquish group that all knew each other. They were from a different town than me. So it was about 10 people or so that all knew each other really well. And I was sort of the added person because of a connection with one of the people in the group. And I was kind of the added person. So I would I went on spring break with this group a couple times. I would be eating lunch and dinner with them a lot of times, going out to parties as you do at universities and so on. But many times, not all the time, but many times I would feel lonely, even though I'm surrounded by people. And that's probably a disconnection with certain people, or not liking the way that the group operates, which I had very little control of since I wasn't part of the clique. They'd known each other for decades before me. So that would be just one example of that. So perhaps you can look in your own life of when you've maybe felt any of these particular categories. And during this period of COVID, it's interesting. I can notice very clearly that there are some people who are just kind of clamoring to get out and be around people, and they just are kind of biting their nails to just get out at any moment that they can. And then there are other people who are just thriving in being by themselves, and maybe they are alone or maybe they're not alone, but they are just thriving the heck out of this period. They're really enjoying what COVID has brought them. And you see it on Facebook, and maybe it's annoying for some of you. But like you'll see some people say, oh, I started this new hobby, and I'm doing this new thing, and I'm doing this new venture, and I started this new nonprofit, and all these new things that they're doing. And so, it's not a right or wrong. We just have to acknowledge where we're at with this whole period and what COVID has done for us or against us. in this and make the most of it, so anyway, for some people it's a thriving period. For others, it's a devastating period. So there's a particular talk show that I watch. It's once a week, very regularly, and never miss it. And I observe the guests on this person's talk show. This person's doing the talk show from their home, and each guest there's something different. Like one guest was I forget the guy's name, but the guy that plays Captain America in the movies, the actual person, obviously, not the superhero. He wasn't on. And this guy just seemed like he's just thriving being by himself. I mean, he's started this new thing and that, and just going well. And then the next week, the next guest is just in this COVID, just devastated. It was a man who just so deeply wanted physical touch and just likes to be out there, like touching and hugging people and loving people. And this time is just absolutely depression engendering misery for him. So we're all in kind of a different place in this, and we have to do what we can do. And so what do we do with this? What is this loneliness? One suggestion is that, we can turn to any of our 24 character strengths, of course. And so one of them is the strength of perspective. Perspective means that we take that bigger picture view. And we begin to then look at loneliness in all its different forms, that there can be a social loneliness that we feel. And that's simply because we're not with our relationship partner at this time, or it's difficult to be around them much, or we don't have family nearby, or they're in a different state or a different country, a different city. So that's kind of one level, sort of a social loneliness that we can feel, where we then feel that deeply in a sad way. But then there's the emotional loneliness that we can feel, and that's kind of what I've been speaking about a little bit, where we feel that deeper sense that on a feeling level, we feel the loneliness. And we might call that psychological loneliness, might call that emotional loneliness. But then there's another loneliness that I like to think of, which is a spiritual loneliness. And I'm not saying that that's increased at this time of COVID, but it's just something that we can feel at any point in our life. And so what I mean by the spiritual loneliness is a person that really feels a sense of being alone in the universe, and is really kind of questioning things in sort of a sad way about that. And maybe the best way to describe it, as some of our earlier sessions, United in Strengths, got at, is meaning, and feeling a lack of meaning in life. The technical word is ennui, ENNUI. And so feeling that lack of meaning in life, and that's creating more of a loneliness that whether it's not belonging, not connecting outside of ourselves, that sort of thing. And of course, some people could make that more about religion, where the person is feeling a disconnection with a higher power of some kind. So that would be another thread, another way of looking at spiritual loneliness. So I wanted to set the stage with some of that. And then I wanted to kind of clear up the maybe the media, if you will, on the data, the research on loneliness, because everybody thinks that loneliness is increasing at COVID. And you might be surprised to know that it's actually not. Loneliness is not increasing during this COVID period, generally speaking. So let me tell you what's been found. So first of all, people living alone has been increasing for a while, before COVID, during COVID, and so on. So that's increasing, but now you see that difference between being alone and being lonely. So despite widespread media claims, there's a study that was just published this year in 2020 that looked at, published in a prestigious journal. So we can't just look at what the blogs are saying or what John Smith is saying on Facebook. We have to actually, what is the science actually saying, if we're trying to see if something like loneliness is actually increasing or not. So published in a prestigious journal, what they did is they took a representative sample, so a wide range of people across ages and race and groups and so on, and it was over 1,000 people in the United States, and gave them different measures before COVID and 2 times during COVID, and found no significant changes in loneliness. And then a second study was published this year in probably the most prestigious medical journal there is. It's called JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, also of Americans, and finding that overall psychological distress has greatly increased So psychological stress, being stressed, being upset, tension, these kind of things have greatly increased during this pandemic. Feelings of loneliness have barely increased. So specifically in 2018, it was at 11%. Here in 2020, 13.8%. So they describe that as a very slight increase. And so, so let me give some caveats now about this research, since it is different than I think what most of us have heard. So one key caveat is that what I just said says nothing about you, about any person on this call. It says nothing about individuals, about anyone here, and whether you've experienced a loneliness increase or not. That's the question that you would pose to yourself, not what a study would say. Because, this research is on groups of people. So it's taking averages, that on average, it's not increasing. But that doesn't mean that it's not increasing a moderate amount, or a lot for you. The second caveat is that both those studies I quoted, and there are others, but those are the two I quoted, are both United States. So this is not, and I know we have a huge number of people around the world across the 6 main continents listening right now. And so this is not necessarily your country. And I don't know the data on your country. Maybe you do. And then a third caveat is that who knows what will happen in this next wave of COVID, which I don't know. Some people say we're in a second wave now. Some say we're still in the first wave. Whatever, wherever we are at in these waves, some would say, it might be different as you have to sustain in coping with COVID month after month. And maybe loneliness isn't going to be a big factor the first few months, but maybe to do this for a year, maybe then it will. So that's a question that hasn't been teased out yet in any study, to my knowledge. So there's certainly more opportunity to be alone and to be lonely at this time. And we know that some groups might be feeling more lonely right now. So somebody in a nursing home that cannot suddenly have any visitors, probably a big increased chance of being lonely. If you're in a romantic relationship and you're not allowed to be with that person because they're on the other side of the city and it's too risky, probably loneliness there. And one study did show among romantic relationships, it's increasing. Among migrants, people who are in a different country than their home country, based on circumstances they wish they did not have to face, they have increased levels of loneliness, trying to cope with the circumstances, missing their home, not belonging to the new culture. All these are reasons. So there are, as you can hear, there are groups where the loneliness might actually be increasing in that sense, despite what I said earlier. But in general, here's another thing that surprised me is that young adults are more likely to be reporting loneliness than older adults. Normally, we think of that in the reverse. So someone's older, so they must be lonely. But a lot of people that are older, they've been coping with things for many more decades than the younger adults. So younger adults, on average, tend to be lonelier than older adults. And that's not a COVID thing. That's just a general thing. And until after the age of 75. And then after the age of 75, again, on average, loneliness increases because then there's more health issues that people typically have to deal with, more potential deaths, like a death of a spouse, death of friends, and so on, coping with. So these are all kind of natural things that that people would be facing as they get older. Okay, so we could keep going on this topic. It's a very rich topic, a very interesting topic. I hope some of that offered some insights or different ways of looking at loneliness and aloneness. Again, we'll keep hammering. That's a huge distinction here. But let's get into a little bit on a couple examples of some coping and some strategies with loneliness, since, again, that's always our focus here in United Strengths, or a big focus, not only educating and bringing forth research, but practical tools. So the first way to set this up is to say that in terms of positive psychology, which is the science of well-being, there have not really been a lot of interventions on loneliness. And in fact, just like a month ago, someone published, in publishing a review of different interventions, actually made that statement that we don't have many research studies on loneliness, if any. So we really don't know what positive psychology interventions have to offer. So that's kind of another caveat that I would give. Not that we can't say lots of great things about character strengths and mindfulness, but at this point, there's just not a ton that's been done. Now, one exception happens to be, perfectly timed here, MBSP, mindfulness-based strengths practice, that a study published this year, this was done on college students, did find that people that took the MBSP program compared to those that did not actually decreased in their loneliness. So MBSP had a positive impact on a number of things, like less depression, greater happiness, better outcomes, even staying in school, that kind of thing, staying in college, but decreased loneliness. So it's just one study. We'll see if that's replicated and repeated, but I thought that was worth mentioning and timely. So then what do we do then about it? So I want to talk about that briefly on a thinking level, a cognitive level, an emotional level, strengths level. So the cognitive level is one thing that is our self-talk. What are we going to say to ourselves when we notice we're feeling lonely? One thing is we could say that typically loneliness is situational and it's transient and it goes away. All of our emotions are things that rise and fall, whether they're positive emotions or negative emotions. We might not notice them, and some of those more negative, painful emotions are stickier and they stick with us, but they're all transient. They all can fade. So we want to remind ourselves that it's not permanent. It's not permanent that I'm destined to feel lonely the rest of my life, because there are things I can do about it. And the situation I'm in might be changing, and so on. The other thing on a cognitive level that's so helpful, I think, and starts to go very deep, and that is that loneliness is just part of being human. Now, I'm not saying permanent, I'm not saying long-term feeling lonely more times than not for 5 years is a normal part of the human condition, but loneliness is part of the human condition, just like our positive and upsetting feelings. It becomes a very existential issue, a very kind of meaning in life type of issue to think about. In other words, I don't think anybody here on this call can refute this that I'm about to say. We are born alone, we live alone in this life as a separate person, and we die alone. So that happens. You can't refute that. Born alone, live alone, die alone. It might sound horrible, but at the same time, it's reality, and that's an existential thing to grapple with and to focus on and to think about. And so it is okay. This is part of being human, to feel some loneliness from time to time. How much will vary by each person. But if it is a passing situational thing, then we say to ourselves, our self-talk says something like, this too shall pass. This is normal. This is part of being human, and so on. Another level is to mindfully investigate it. That would be a big thing that I would encourage people to do, which is, if you're feeling lonely, to pause and bring in the areas of United in Strengths, the tagline. Breathe with the loneliness. Remember, you have 24 strengths that are part of your human condition as well. And connect inside of yourself, connect you with you in a deeper way, a meaningful way, and connect with other people in a meaningful way, which is, of course, a key remedy for loneliness, to connect more with people in a common ground, so that you're not feeling lonely in a group, but instead connecting with people. On an emotional level, that was more cognitive level stuff, a little bit of social, but on an emotional level, I think it's invaluable to try to make a concerted effort to talk about deeper things with people. One of my biggest pet peeves is when the only conversation is about, what did you have for breakfast, or the Facebook types of things, or just, I did this today, then I did this, then I did this. And it's very much kind of on the surface of things. So why not? And of course, some of that is fine, talking about the weather, of course we have to sometimes do that, but get to the deeper stuff, at least sometimes, with some people in your life. And if you have people in your life that you can talk about the meaning of life, talk about feelings in a deep way, talk about what really matters to you, what matters most in life, how things are really affecting you in a deep way, that's a connecting thing. That's deeper connective tissue for you to manage loneliness than, what's the weather like in your city? Oh, well, it's hot for me. Yeah, I hope it'll be hotter. Well, I hope it'll get to 70. Maybe it won't. What was it like last year for you? Was it 60 or 70? I mean, it just, you get the point. So we can go deep with our discussions. Can't do it with all people all the time, but you can do it more. And I'll just a reminder to conclude this part on the strengths, that we can turn to any of our 24 character strengths to help us on this journey. So whether that's you decide, and you pick the strength. So I would encourage you to consider how any of your 24 character strengths can be relationship oriented, so that you can turn any of the 24 character strengths toward the other person and be a connecting way to deepen that connective tissue between you and the other person, whoever that person is. Maybe it's a neighbor and that surprises you that you connect with them more, or maybe it's your child, or maybe it's a different loved one or a colleague, and so on. So you might turn to curiosity to ask 2 more questions than you typically do. That would be great growth, to go from 1 question on average to 3. That's a big change. Maybe it's using your self-regulation strength when you're in conversation, to not just do all the talking and to do more listening, to hold yourself back a little bit. Maybe it's gratitude, and you consciously allow yourself to feel more gratitude that you're with another human being. Dealing with that whole "we live life alone" thing, and you can be grateful for any connection that you actually get to make. It's a wonderful opportunity for gratitude. Maybe it's forgiveness. Maybe you have a little grudge you're holding against one of your parents or a friend, and you're kind of holding it a little bit harder than you thought. So maybe forgiveness, letting it go and connecting with them. Maybe it's fairness. You don't typically return the call of one of your acquaintances. You just don't feel like it. But out of fairness, I try to return most of my calls. Let me return that call too. So you can turn to any of these 24 character strengths. You can turn to prudence to start making plans to connect more with other people and map it out. I'm going to connect with 1 person a day. Or I'm going to ask 1 meaningful question to get at that depth a little bit more with my friend in each conversation. So you map out a plan. So any of the 24 are possible. Okay, so those are some thoughts. Those are some thoughts about loneliness and aloneness and feeling lonely, and some strategies. So now let's turn very briefly to a meditation to just sort of build on what we're doing here, and really to try to make a concrete example within this meditation that you might like to use as an application for yourself this week. So I just invite you to have your eyes open or closed. If your eyes are closed, you can focus inward nicely. If your eyes are open, focus in on 1 spot in front of you. And just begin by feeling your in-breath and your out-breath, to root yourself into this present moment. Feeling your breath in the silence. And within this space of your breath, where you can feel empowered and rooted with your mindfulness, I invite you to consider an upcoming moment or situation in your life when you might feel lonely. When you think you might feel, it's more likely you'll feel lonely. Maybe it's an upcoming evening when you'll be by yourself when you usually aren't. Maybe it's part of a weekend when you wish you were doing something socially. So just think of that potential moment in time, that situation in time, coming up, perhaps in the next week. It's just a possibility. You're just kind of taking an educated guess here. And I want to invite you to see yourself in this experience and see yourself facing the loneliness head on. I want to invite you to just breathe with the loneliness. So try to just picture yourself doing this. See yourself doing this in the future. Even saying to yourself, It's okay to feel this. I don't have to run to it. I don't have to distract myself with something. I don't have to go eat or drink or escape in a TV show. I can just breathe with it. It's just part of my experience right now. It's okay. See yourself acknowledging the feeling, being open to that part of yourself, accepting it. Accepting it. And then in this future moment, I want to invite you to see yourself using one or more of your character strengths. To help you in that moment. It might be self-regulation, to breathe with the loneliness more. It might be kindness or fairness or forgiveness turned inward. It might be creativity that says, this loneliness now that I'm feeling and I'm okay with, it's going to catalyze me to take all sorts of creative action. I'm going to make 2 phone calls after this. So again, any of the 24 are possible. Turn to your own wisdom within and see what strengths you might use in this future situation and how you'd use them. And know that now that you've done some visualizing of this with mindfulness and with character strengths, you're creating an increased likelihood of handling the loneliness in an optimal way, a healthy way, a way of learning and growing. Please take whatever wisdom you get from your experience with you, very consciously, very deliberately, as you move forward today.